individual is issued. Because we're a self-sovereign, individually controlled network, there's always an offer, and the individual always needs to accept that offer. So you can't push anything to someone. Right? There's nowhere to push something to. You make an offer to an individual, the individual chooses to accept it. And then that activity of offering, making that assertion by the issuer to the holder is done through a peer-to-peer connection. So we're often asked, so what goes to velocity? Right? Where's velocity in this? No, there's a peer-to-peer connection between the issuer and the individuals. So the issuer through what we would call a credential agent, or what Dominique from Vault ID would call their SSI kit, or any other technology that enables issuing, and an individual's holder app, what we would call a wallet, right? And that is a peer-to-peer transaction. But through that peer-to-peer transaction, those verifiable credentials are transferred to the individual. And the proof of that verifiable credential is anchored to the Velocity blockchain as a new block. There's only metadata there. There's no personal identifiable information, and nothing other than a long string of letters and numbers. How many letters and numbers? What's the block? What's the proof look like? The string of
each key.
Yeah. He doesn't know. I don't know. Okay. 256. Okay. So that's what issuing is. Okay. Everyone's still with us, or falling asleep? Not yet. Okay. I'm not going to read through these. I'm posting it here. All these are on the new website. There's a whole language. Some of you are very familiar with this language. Some of you use these words and mean something different to what we use the language. So we do want to make sure we're talking about the same language. I won't go through these. If we relate to any of them later in the session and they're not clear, we can come back here. I just put it here, and there's, if you go to the new website, to the section around learn, you can find a glossary of key terms and so on, where you can find all this information. So again, I'm not reading through this, but hopefully most of these terms seem pretty natural or relevant to everyone here. Yes? Okay. Okay, good. And a few more. I will just relate, because I was noted that we use this term, and it may be confusing to people who aren't already installing this. It's a term that is less known. So when we refer to the credential agent, okay, it's a piece of software that's been developed by VCL, is available royalty-free and open source to anyone who wants to use it, which basically enables issuing and inspection. So any organization who wants to do issuing and inspection, they can basically install a credential agent, integrate it with their systems and processes, and run and enable. And the rest of the activity that happens on the network is done through the credential agent. Okay? And as I just mentioned, Velocity is technology agnostic. So there isn't one credential agent called this one, but there will be many others. And all that idea is building theirs on the Velocity network, and it's fine if any of you want to develop your own, or already have built something like that and want to make it compatible to the Velocity network, like Anders needs that like a hole in the head right now, or Moshe Tzvi now to help do that, but we want this to be technology agnostic and to be able to do that. So this is not about technology, it's around the protocols to be able to enjoy a common network. So I just wanted to mention what that is, because we're going to use that all the time.
And I'll plug a session tomorrow. For anybody who wants to learn more about credential agents, we've got a session tomorrow on credential agents.
Right, tomorrow at the second breakout, room B, last session, is a session on non-binary credential agent. Moshe Tzvi is going to lead. And
where is the credential agent installed in the cloud?
So great question. So I'll look for a slide later. No, the very simple answer is you're in the cloud of the issuer or the inspector. And the reason it's in the cloud of the issuer and inspector is because it does contain personal identifiable information. If you're an issuer, the process to issue goes through the data that's being issued goes through the credential agent, and therefore there's personal identifiable information in it before it gets transferred to the individual's wallet. And if the individual is sharing it with the organization, there's personal identifiable information coming in the credential from the individual through the credential agent into your systems. And so there are other alternatives, like having a service hosting in the cloud. I'm sure Paul will be happy to talk about that alternative, but it opens another vendor and privacy That's pulled from join. But in privacy related, so now you have a third party where the person identifiable information is. So the core, simplest solution is to simply install the credential agent within the cloud of the issuer or inspector and integrate it into whatever systems are there. Other questions so far? Okay. This is a very, very basic, I'm going to dive into each of these in a second, but a very, very basic presentation of the flow on velocity. All right? And then I'll dive into each of these. So I just want to set this as the stage, and then we'll go into each of these boxes a little bit more. Okay? So there's activity to prepare the offer, okay, that happens prior to the offer. And since we'll talk about a couple different options of the way offers can be made, there are different alternatives of what preparing an offer looks like. But it's basically deciding what credentials I want to provide to which individuals and in what format I want to do that. All right. There are a number of different ways to trigger the process, and I'll show that. But that could be triggered by the individual or it could be triggered by the organization. Regardless of which, the result of that trigger is this creation of this peer-to-peer connection between the individual's wallet, holder app, and the organization's credential agent. Right? That's the result of whether you've triggered it from one side or from the other. It's creating this technical connection, communication connection. The next step is, one of the things where we find is the most critical value of the velocity network is trust. And trust sits on the fact that, although it's a peer-to-peer connection, both sides know that they're actually connecting to the right person or the right entity. Right? The individual knows that it's actually connected to the organization it wants to get credentials from, and that's the real organization. And the organization knows that it's actually issuing to the right person, and that's actually that real person. This is really critical, or we're just creating another set of garbage. Right? And so the next step in the process is verifying mutual identity. As an individual, I want to know, is this connected to something? Am I actually connected to my university or my employer or my licensing body and so on? And as an organization, Etan Bernstein reached out and said he wants his degree or his employment history and so on. How do I know it's actually Etan Bernstein? Right? So this is the next step in the process. Once we know that we're actually the two right entities that are actually in this process together, the next step is to actually make an offer. So the issuing organization presents an offer of a credential or multiple credentials to the individual. Right? It says, this is what we have to offer you. And the individual can then decide whether they want to accept one of them, all of them, as many as they choose. And if they decide to accept those credentials are actually issued formally to the individual, which is two things that happen in parallel. One is the JSON file as the format of a verifiable credential is transferred to the individual wallet. And the second is that a cryptographic key in the form of the public key that is the proof of that credential is written to the velocity ledger. Those two things happen, so the individual owns the credential himself, and the proof of that credential is now on the ledger. I say something absolutely stupid or correct. Not the little stupid thing, this is the big one. Okay. This is the actual issuing process. Okay. Then there are two processes I'm not going to talk about in detail today, because we just won't have time for everything. Okay. Another is to understand what's happening with monitored credentials. And the second is what happens if I'm an issuer, and once I've issued that credential, I want to revoke that credential. Okay, so these are steps that happen relating to a specific credential after that step has already happened. We're not going to talk about it today. There is technical documentation. There is technical documentation, both of them. We're not going to, unless we have a little bit of time. Unless we have a little bit of time at the end, we can dive into them, but just be aware that although each transaction ends at this credential being issued, there are activities related to the entity of that credential that can happen after that event is over. Okay? That all makes sense? Yes? So let's take UKG is issuing employment. Okay, this could be a good UKG. Let's take this as, so now I'm an employee, I work at a customer of UKG, and I while employed or maybe a year after I've left, I want to have proof of my employment. I assume today there's a business process where I can get a PDF file, a letter that says I worked from this date to that date, or some other way of giving me some documentation or proof of myself had been employed at a UKG-run employer, right? Employer running a UKG system of record, in some format, probably a PDF file, I assume, as a letter, which I can't really do anything with because Heidi Decisive won't trust that for life because it's a piece of paper and anyone could write it, right? So this really has no value for almost anything in itself. The alternative would be me reaching out with my wallet, searching for that employer, which is running a UKG system, and saying, I'd like my verified credential of my employee. Your credential agent would look into your system of record and say, okay, this person has actually worked for my customer from this date to that date, issue that as a verifiable credential. Now I have digital proof. And when I share that with Decisive, Decisive can trust that because it's actually signed by your customer, by the UKG customer.
So, no, my question, that's the reason. I'm sorry. I have
No, wonderful. This is why we're here.
This is, so here the identity of a user is basically UKG's customer's user ID, which can be AAD account.
So let's talk about identity. It's one of our chapters in our how you identify the person. So I said we're going to get into each of these. What is considered solid enough identity, and how do you identify a person is part of the process we'll talk about.
And then other question related to that is, sorry, that was one of the things, what is the identity? The one was basically who is the credential agent? I mean, credential agent is UKG, of course, but what would be our customer's role here? Is
Right.
he a tenant or who is
Yes, so most likely, there are a lot of alternatives, but most likely a UKG would be the credential agent operator. So you actually operate the credential agent as part of the UKG, one of the UKG products that you have. The issuer, your customer would be, in this case, we're talking about issuing, an issuer. They would register on the network as an issuer. And basically, you're collaborating about making an issuing event. They're signing the credential. It's their ID or their DID that's actually signing the credentials. So they're the ones responsible legally for the content. You're just giving them a system of record, a SaaS solution to run it. They're the ones actually signing it. You're getting rewarded by the foundation because you're enabling your technology to make it happen. And they're getting rewarded because they're issuing a credential.
So they will get rewarded.
And so do you for every credential that you issue on your system.
Have to be a tenant with a DID, a proper DID.
Every participant, every issuer, and every inspector in the network, just like anyone on the internet. If you want to be on the internet, you need to register at your domain, you need to have an IP address, and so on. In the same way, any participant on the Velocity network needs to register on the Velocity network, have a DID, and if they're, by the way, if they're inspecting, we'll talk about that now, where they need to be able to have the funds, the Velocity credits or vouchers to inspect. If they're issuing, they were rewarded, and if they want to be able to see that reward, they want to have access to a wallet to view that.
Thank you.
Other things on this?
One
Heidi.
question, when you say it's written to the velocity ledger, is that then forever and ever, or does that have a shelf life?
That's for the writing of it is forever and ever. The credential itself, the proof is there forever. The credential itself may have expiration date. That depends on the issuer. So if I'm issuing a nurse's degree that has a 2-year lifetime, it's part of the content of the credential. And not the proof that that credential was issued. Even if it's expired, we still want to have proof. So if I would have said I had an active nursing license from 1997 to 1999, I should still be able to prove that. I can't, it's useless because the date of expiration is on it, but I still want to be able to show that I did have that and it did exist.
And will it show expired in the individual's wallet then?
Yes.
Yes.
Additionally, this question also can be taken to relate to data privacy regulations like the GDPR. So, what is the consequence? Within the GDPR, there's a right to
Be forgotten.
to be forgotten, also for your data to be deleted. The way it's implemented, like the regulation isn't written for these sorts of systems, but the way that works in this sort of system is that you can delete it from your wallet, and as soon as that happens, the information that's on the ledger still, right, it cannot be deleted. It's an immutable ledger, but it's meaningless. It can contains no personal identifying information anymore, and therefore there's no issues
Without the private key, which is part of the credential you've just erased, it has no.
Yeah, it's fully anonymized. So there's no way it can be related
Mission
back to the
Impossible.
individual.
None of that.
So as you get new credentials, if something were to expire and you let it lapse for a period of time, and get a new one, does that become a new?
It's a new credential. And even if you have a credential, so let's talk about a use case where you, for instance, we have a set of schemas where if you apply for school, you've already been accepted, but you haven't even started for a course, that can be already a credential, because sometimes it's valuable to say I've already been accepted and I'm about to be a student. I am a student and I've graduated, or 3 credentials. Because again, we can't augment, we can't change anything, right? This is immutable. So part of the process, if you'd like, we can talk about a little bit further, is basically revoking. If you move from being a candidate to be, or accepted individual to being a student, you're actually revoking this credential and issuing another one. When you graduate, you're revoking the student one and issuing a graduate one, right? So these are tied together, and that's an issue of how you presented it from a UI perspective, but each of those credentials is a separate credential on the Velocity network.
So would it have the same exchange ID?
No, it's separate. It's a new interaction. There is a linking similar to like how you build a database of people. So there is a reference back to that original credential, which can be utilized by the user interfaces to explain that this one is replacing that old one, and those sorts of things. But for the intents and purposes of the individual, it's a new credential, and also for the verifier, that reliant party later.
What is the differential ID you're talking about? Is it part of one of the?
Yeah, it's every credential is an ID. That's unique.
You were going to ask a question?
I did 2 short questions.
Yeah, of course.
I guess just following on this UKG example, without being like overly reductive about this, and that's the case, just saying we'll talk about it.
Okay.
Which is, I guess, when someone's submitting this request for verification, and UKG is the issuer, I guess like my simple mind just goes to, but UKG is not the employer, they're an agent of the employer. And so, like if I'm applying for some hourly gig at an hourly job at XYZ, I'm sort of curious, like, does that satisfy the requirement? I mean, what technically is happening is you're saying, okay, UKG paid this person as an employee, or he was on the employee roster. Does that really satisfy the work verification credential?
So good question. So let's go back, let's close the whole loop a second. Give me a name of a big UKG customer that's public information. Google, okay? I'm working, I'll never get into Google, but let's say I'm working at Google, and I ask to have a credential, a proof of my employment. It gets issued out of UKG's system, but it's signed by Google. So it's a verifiable credential that Google attests. What the credential actually is saying is Google attests to the fact that I worked in this job title from this date to that date. Okay, now it's immutable proof, and it's signed by Google's DID. And we'll talk about verification next hour. Okay, but that is, we can verify that it's actually Google and that it hasn't been tampered with and so on. That was issued to me. Now, when I share it to it was done through the UKG system, but UKG is not even visible as part of that credential. When I share that with another employer, what they're seeing is instead of a piece of paper or a PDF file, they're seeing a verifiable credential signed by Google's DID, claiming that I worked from this date to this date with this job title. Right, that's what.
I missed that flow.
That's why I went back to it. You said there was another question.
So, without being overly blunt, but so is the motivation then for UKG to do this to earn those credits? Or, I mean, obviously it makes the customers happy, it makes the employees happy, but is the real...
So have a conversation. I think different members here, since I talk to almost everyone, have different motivations.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are also that. So the reason we created the Velocity credits, and there's a session today, tomorrow, there's a session on the Velocity today with Joel and Jim Owens from Sisiv on the monetization. The reason we created the velocity credits was because there was a question by members around how do we monetize this and how do we, okay, great, really cool, it's the right thing to do, it's wonderful, but okay, but we need to build a business case, and how do I go to my CFO and justify this? So yes, so part of the reason for some of our members, I won't speak for UKG or any of them, is that there's another line of revenue or a way to monetize things that I'm doing anyway. Okay, others are, it's a competitive advantage, it's much better for my customer base, and other things. But the financial aspect is definitely, we wouldn't have built, Andres has built a lot of tech to enable the payment and reward system to work. We wouldn't have done it if we didn't believe that a lot of our members find it part of the motivation to do this.
Thank you. Yeah, so just following up on the GDPR kind of topic. So is there any conversations with these issuers that actually are data stores on all these users essentially of tying GDPR into that? So if I want to break the relationship, you know, the right to be forgotten, right? I'm going to delete the credential in my wallet, but all my data is still with the issuer. Is there any conversations happening?
So part of the reason why we are getting those existing data processes to install the credential agent is because they already have a responsibility under GDPR to handle requests for deletion. So it doesn't change their exposure with respect to compliance requirements that they have. And they're not therefore suddenly, oh, now I've got to talk to some other company that's running their SaaS that now has a copy of that employee or student's information. And therefore now that individual or that company needs to now get that deletion sent to another organization. So we've built it like that. It's not like we're excluding the possibility of those sorts of SaaS companies from arriving. Obviously, for a lot of small organizations, it would make sense, but if you're a UKG, you want to control everything that's happening in this data, and you want to have that peer relationship with that individual only, and you don't want to have to deal with PCL or Joined or some other organization, right, that might be hosting data now on your behalf.
So is that a consideration of the credential agent of processing those kind of replication?
Yes, so you can, with respect to deleting that data, you can configure the credential agent to remove all personal identifying information after a period of time. It can be immediately after the credentials issued even, if you prefer. Or you can go in and just request deletion on an ad hoc basis as well.
I'm going to run through some stuff just to make sure the detailed process is clear, and then we'll stop again for some more questions, okay? Good. Okay, so this is a drill down. So remember, one box was prepare the offer, now it's all those boxes. One box was launch the process, now it's a little bit more detail. So same slide, just a little bit more detail to get into. So when we prepare the process, we have two fundamental ways of doing it today. And you guys may need more ways, and we'll develop them in the future. But today, there are two fundamental ways of doing that. One is what someone mentioned earlier today is batch issuing. Batch issuing is basically the capability of simply uploading a CSV file into the credential agent, so it doesn't require a system of record of any form. It's a great way to start issuing quickly, to do things simply. And again, if you go to the session Moshe Tzvi is doing tomorrow, he'll also be demoing batch issuing. And we'll give you a preview into the credential you're all going to get tomorrow as a result of that demo. That is not, in our view, the long-term sustainable solution. Many of you run systems, and the long-term sustainable solution is an integration into your system of record, which is holding the individual's data. But we really encourage members who are starting to experiment with and do stuff to do batch issuing. It's a fast way of going up in live, and what some of the stuff you'll see today, tomorrow, and the next few months being announced, a lot of it is just quick ways of doing batch issuing.
Okay, the batch issuing, by preparing the offer, by integration with the system of record, that could also be done as a batch, right? Like you integrating.
No. So I'm just going to talk about technically how this happens, but this is building an integration through the APIs and through the webhooks of the credential agent and APIs to your system of record, and basically saying the credential agent is actually, what you need to do is set the rules of what the credential agent, which credentials in your system of record you have access to, basically to be able to offer to the individuals.
Right, but you can batch it yourself.
You can batch it yourself.
Yes,
In that
yes,
system,
yes,
sure.
yes, in that system. Right. So those are two options. All these lines, which I apologize for, are just to say, if you do a batch issuing, you have to send an individual, currently the way the system works, communication, because they can't search for that issuer on their wallets. I hope you all already have a Velocity Career Wallet, and you'll see that you can search for issuers. When you do a batch issuing, the only way to trigger the process is by issuing a letter, an email, a page on a website with either a QR code or a deep link, depending on what format you're going to be getting that, and that triggers the connection. You can do that with the system of record integration as well, but with the system integration record, you can also, individual can just search and find Google, or I worked at Intel, find Intel, and ask, do you have any credentials on me in your system of record, basically, is what they're doing through there. So that's option only when you have this integration. Okay, so that's just to show all these options. Sorry for the very complicated way. Once the individual either receives communication or searches, basically they're making the connection, the peer-to-peer connection, and now we're already in a connection between the individual's holder app and the credential agent, and the issuing process starts. Okay, any, makes sense? Yeah.
You mentioned very important point. Individual looks for Google or UKG.
No, they look for Google.
They look for Google.
I said Intel. I purposely didn't say UK.
Okay, Intel or
Your employer, my education institution, and so on.
basically they look for Intel. So in the case of system of record, Intel doesn't own the system of record. The way we
Right, but what,
basically it can be a data warehouse, and I have API speaking with the data warehouse, multi-tenant data warehouse. So I don't have to go to the Google system. You got my point? So how would Google be aware of? I know I created a did or tendency of React.
so this credential agent is an endpoint, or a tenant on that credential agent is an endpoint identified through Google's DID. And that's what you're finding when you're searching on the wallet. You're finding an endpoint on
Google's did.
on
So
Google's
I
DID.
created a tenant with the Google's did.
Right, so if UKG is a multi-tenant system, each one of your customers who you want to enable on UKG, you'll have a credential agent, which is a multi-tenant credential agent, and each issuer, we'll talk about issuing tomorrow, later we'll talk about inspection, is a separate tenant on your UKG credential agent.
So is this multi-tenant did hooked up with the reward system is distributed to all these tenants?
Yes.
So today I see the dashboard only for UKG because we are only running the mainnet. But
Right.
tomorrow in future, if we use the credential agent as an issuer, I see, say I have 100,000 customers, I see all the rewards for 100,000 customers.
Your half, not their half. So when you're enabling issuing, when you enable issuing for Google, the credential agent registered for that issuing is UKG, and the tenant that is identified as the endpoint is identified as Google. Only Google sees their reward, and only you see your reward from a lot of different tenants as a credential agent.
So Google
I'm not
will-
wrong, right?
Google
I
will
didn't
get
say-
their own
100%.
reward.
Okay.
Google will get their own reward system.
Yes.
They have their own username and login.
In that case, Google would have to register as an organization.
Google needs to register because they're going to be issuing, and they need an endpoint which needs to be identified through the Google DID.
They register, but we're using them as a credential.
How would Google register if they don't have, are they registering through their own infrastructure? Because we are hosting the node, we are hosting the credentials. for them.
They're registering here. You want to answer that?
So at the moment, it's an API call that they need to make to the network to register, but in about a month and a half or so, we hope to have a web page out that they'll be able to go to and register.
So they can go to a simple web page,
Yeah.
because the
Think-
API call is really, they have to go through our infrastructure.
So think about it. I think that, look, I'm not technical. I'm probably one of the least technical people in the room. I understand that, for instance, JobVite presented. Andrew was not able to come, but had the video earlier today. Right? When they have a recruiting marketing system for HCA, you saw their logo on. Then in the end, you're going to hca.com. You're going to look for jobs, and you're actually what you're seeing is a JobVite or a telemetry system, right? The URL of hca.com is registered on the internet to HCA, and HCA is giving JobVite the ability to present through their it's exactly the same process, okay, basically. For what I can understand as a non-technical person. Let me run through this. Sorry, because I want to get through a few things that at least everyone gets a chance to see and they want to answer. So we've launched the process. Those two were on the last slide. Nothing new here. Okay? And then what happens is the following, which you'll experience tomorrow. I promise you, personally. Okay? The wallet will verify that the issuer that it's connected to is actually registered and is a real organization on the Velocity network. So that the individual gets a feedback, and you'll see that personally tomorrow if you accept a credential we'll be offering you, that you're verifying. So I know, okay, this is actually I've actually linked through my wallet to the real organization I intended to do, and it's someone posing as someone else or trying to be someone else. And then there's a process, so now the individual can trust the system. Now the organization asks the individual to identify itself or herself. All right, so the fact that I have access to this QR code or deep link doesn't mean I'm actually who this was supposed to be sent to. So the issuer basically requests identity credentials from the individuals. And that's up to you to decide which identity credentials. I have a whole slide about this in a second. It could be just an email for a lot of credentials. That's what many organizations use. It could be, if it's a background screening company, it may be very detailed. We want your social security number. We want your national ID. If you're in the Netherlands, we want your driver's license. Whatever verifiable information you need to feel confident that this is actually the person that you're issuing to. The individual shares those credentials with the organization. Of course, it sees T's and C's, accepts the terms and so on. And then the individual, the issuing organization verifies that those are verifiable credentials. So they actually verify that they're actually correct. So run a verification, like we'll talk about in verification in another hour. That verification, by the way, is free. So verifying identity on the network is free because it's a basic transaction that enables the other things to happen. Right? And then if it's using the option of batch issuing, it's already has that person already identified in the credential agent. If it's not, it needs to go to the system of record and say, okay, I have this person. Do I have any records for that individual to issue to? Right? This is all the matching process. Once they've done that, okay, if in the system of record or in the preloaded agent there is a credential or multiple credentials ready to serve, those records are presented to the individual's wallet. The individual sees those credentials as offers. The individual can review each of them, go into them, see what's in there, and so on. If there's something that seems wrong, doesn't want that credential, finds it useless, and so on, can just decline. Nothing's happened, nothing's been transferred, nothing's been anchored, and so on. If the individual accepts the offer, the credential agent basically, up to now it's just been a presentation of the information. Now it's wrapped as a verifiable credential, transferred to the individual's wallet, and the credential agent writes a new block to the blockchain to a near node, and that node then communicates with other nodes and distributes that information across the ledger, the distributed ledger. Okay, so that's basically the issuing process. Yes? Okay? Yeah.
Who decides what data gets into a credential? For example, my college diploma, I have the name of the college, obviously my program, major, minor, whatever. Does it have the GPA or not? Or do I decide as
an individual? So let's talk about schemas in 1 second. Perfect question. Great question. Yeah?
On the bulk issuing, do we associate that CSV with the DID? Do we kind of connect it to, let's say, Google? Yeah.
Yes. So it's exactly the same. So let's take your Kelly example, right? So Cornerstone hopefully will be issuing with Kelly, a member that unfortunately no one could be here these 2 days. Kelly is the issuer. They need to be registered and have a DID. You're running a tenant of Kelly on the Cornerstone on demand credential agent. And it's just instead of it into full integration into Cornerstone on demand, it's just a CSV file that is issued through that tenant.
So a follow-up on that is, we need to send an email or some kind of a notification for them to claim that.
Correct.
So is there any webhook or something, that kind of tells that this user has been loaded onto credential agent that, you need to send an email? Because my system of record now is not going to identify or generate the offer. I need to know that I need to send an email to this user. Is there a way that?
You want to react to that?
Sure. So if you come to the session tomorrow, I'm actually going to walk through live all the steps, so you'll be able to see what happens. But basically, when you set up the batch, it executes, and at that point, you get a CSV with a matrix of all the individuals that you're issuing to, and the QR codes and the links for them, and then you can just run a mail merge on it and send them a mail, right, with this is what was issued to, which is exactly what we're going to be doing with all of you guys tomorrow, where you'll see the QR code, you'll see the link, and then you can click on it and activate it. Thanks.
Great. I now want to spend the remaining time we have talking about 5, in my opinion, the key 5 product decisions. There are many other smaller decisions, but the key 5 product decisions that if you're an issuer or a credential agent operator who is going to enable issuers, you need to think about as you're designing your processes and your product, okay? So one of them, which relates to what Ellie was asking, is what are we actually issuing from a career credential? Which schemas, which information, and so on do you want to issue? We'll dive into this in a second. The second is the identity question that already came up here. So what am I going to be using as the identity to identify that I'm actually issuing to the right person? The third is, when do I want to do this? There are all kinds of different options. There are many different kinds of players in the room here. So, I could just describe different kinds of use cases, but it really depends on your business process and policies, and we'll talk about that. How are you going to communicate it? So you asked technically, how do I get that information? But what you communicate and how you communicate. I asked Yoko, if you noticed, and we'll make all this information from these 2 days public, but he put the letter, I asked him specifically to put the email that they sent to their employees. We want to collect a database of good communication and learn about best practice. Right now, up till now, Etan, Joko shared they have about 30% acceptance of that offer up till now, right? Is that good? Is that bad? If we had written it differently, would it be higher? If there was more Q&A, would it be we want to learn. So we want to build as a community best practices on what helps people understand this, feel confident about it, and so on, and the way it's communicated. So we'll talk about that in a second. And if you decide to use batch issuing, I'll mention a little bit more things, but most important is to come to Moshe Tzvi's session tomorrow. Because I plugged it again. So I want to go through each of these. So I want to relate to each of these 5 questions relatively briefly. Okay, so one is the career credentials. So this is a big decision. So if you're a university, even a university, I used to think until I got involved in Velocity, what's the big deal? It's a degree. I know what my piece of paper has. I know what my transcript says. But as you heard, I think earlier today, education is becoming a little bit more complicated than that. Do we issue micro-credentials? Do we issue skills? Do you issue proof of badges of extracurricular activity? If I was the captain of the hockey team, maybe that's something that is valuable for me to be able to show and prove. So even the question of what do I issue and in what format do I issue? So you heard Marty from Rhonda earlier say, we want to issue CLRs, Comprehensive Learner Records, which is a standard, an emerging standard, I would say, in the education space in the US. And as a layer 2. So I'm not going to talk a lot about layer 1 and layer 2, but because it's a whole session in itself. But there are alternatives. And then which kinds of credentials and which schemas and which formats do I use are major questions, right? So I'll just say that right now, as the Velocity Network, we have, and all this is documented. If you go to the new website, there's access to read all the exact schemas and structures of all these current schemas. And there's a session tomorrow run by Andres and Rick Barfoot from Joint, who's the chairman of our standards committee, around the schemas and around what do you need to do if you want to have a new schema. Because one of the advantages of the Velocity Network is that we want to serve you. So if there's a new emerging schema or something that you need that isn't supported, I'll give an example that UKG will like. We don't have a schema for a paycheck. It's not there. Will there be a schema for a paycheck? Well, it's pretty much up to you and Niamo and a few other organizations that are doing payroll, maybe Oracle, that'll decide whether we need to have a schema and whether people will want to have that. I can think of a lot of use cases where having a verifiable credential of a paycheck could be really, really valuable. But it's not there yet because it hasn't been a demand from our members. And what's important, which is this note here, it's not trivial to match information you want to issue to a specific schema. I'll give an example. I'm a course provider, so hopefully tomorrow you'll see John from Domain U present. Domain U is a learning platform, and they're starting to issue verifiable credentials of that learning. Okay, I'm issuing learning. I could use a course, and course completion. It's a certain schema we have. I could use a certificate. Some courses, the result of them is having a certificate at the end of the course. Or I could use a badge. Open badge is a relatively common standard that people are using and posting on LinkedIn. I have this open badge and so on. A lot of the current credentialing platforms, digital credentialing platforms, are using Open Badge 2.0 standards. So even though there may be some schemas that are more precise for that need, maybe an Open Badge schema is the right one to use. So it's not a one-to-one simple decision, unfortunately, and there are different ways of doing this. So you need to decide as an organization which layer 1 schema you use. I'm not going to get deeply into this layer 1, layer 2, but since I put this question, the Velocity is very, very focused on interoperability. And interoperability means that I can graduate from a university in Timbuktu and move to Kansas, and the university there or the employer there will be able to understand what my credential means. Okay? And in order to do that, in an ideal world, there would be global standards for HR data or education data, but there aren't. And global standards, and there aren't.
There's statewide standards?
And since there aren't, and Velocity is not going to take the responsibility of trying to solve that problem for the world, when it gets solved, we'll support the solution. We needed to create something that can ensure interoperability, but support all the richness of complexity that the world currently has. And Andres came up with a brilliant solution. You can smile. It's okay. Of a layer 1, layer 2, every credential has to be issued as a layer 1 to ensure global interoperability, and can be issued as a layer 2 to provide the richness of ecosystems that exist with different standards. A good example is the CLR example that Marty provided today. Universities in the US, maybe some other types of institutions, are starting to adopt CLRs as a standard. That's great if you're another university or an organization adopting CLR. But if I graduate from a university in Texas and have a CLR, and I go to Europe, who accept Europass, they wouldn't know what to do with a CLR. None of their systems accept a CLR. So what they will accept is there's a CLR, but on top of that CLR connected to it, there's a degree. Where's my degree? Degree credential that everyone can for sure interpret and understand and trust. Okay, and so that's the layer 1 in a very simplistic way, a layer 1, layer 2. And so there are decisions here that any issuer needs to decide, do I only use layer 1s and which one? And if I want to use layer 2, which layer 1 do I tie it to? Which layer 2 do I create? What my ecosystem value? The individuals holding this, where will they be able to use it, and so on. So there are questions which each of you in your different part of your industry will know better.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So usually, like, skills, for instance, you get skills after you take some courses. After you take some courses, you get the certification. So how do you connect the layer 2 in this 3 levels of credentials? Like, if I want to get skills.
So skills is a very interesting, tricky, we can have a very long philosophical discussion. If you notice, right now, and this may change, it's up to you guys, okay? It doesn't say skills here. Skills is a word that are still interpreted by many different people as many different things, right? And just as you said, for some people, proof of skill is I completed a course. And some people, proof of skill is I've completed an assessment, right? And for instance, Yoko talked about that they're going to be doing their assessments of programming. So proof of programming is a score in my assessment. I have 98 in my Java programming capability, whatever. Proof of skill could be a certification. I have a CompTIA certification. Gordon is here somewhere, not in this room. From CompTIA, I have proved my skill because I have a CompTIA certification of that skill. So skills are still, many of you in this room use that term skills to mean different things. And the industry, and so there may be something more that supports skills, but right now skills, when you guys say skills, what the Velocity Network currently knows how to support is a badge that says that skill, or an assessment that proves a test result in that skill, or a course that you completed. That's what skill actually means. So it's already in layer 1, but if you create something new, we can create it in layer 2.
Right now, in the US, we have owner data, which is kind of a standard, close to like
Right.
20,000 skill sets.
Right.
In Europe, you have your skill and things like that. So those are kind of standards defined by
Perfect.
different regions. Australia has its own.
Correct.
Has its own. Combined, probably it will be more than 100,000 records. So, but they cannot translate into assessment or course. Probably this is a topic for tomorrow, but I think.
So it's a topic for 2 sessions. One you just missed, because Deb Everard from Credential Engine was talking about linked open data. Every one of our schemas has an alignment field. Alignment field is a field for linked open data. In order to align a credential with a third-party source, like Credential Engine, which Deb just talked about, or other third parties, so that you can interpret, you can say, this credential is actually like this stuff, or here's more information on the credential. So that's one aspect of it, is using linked open data to provide more context and to connect to existing taxonomies, right, or more information. That's why every one of our schemas has an alignment field. And we want to encourage all of our members to issue credentials with an alignment field. So that's one aspect of it. Okay. The other aspect, I forgot what I was going to say, so I lost my train of thought. I'll remember. Sorry.
2 sessions. It was 2 sessions.
2 sessions.
The one you just missed, and the other one was.
The other one relates to a session that's happening, in a half an hour or so. I think you have anyone has a program, which is the one on interoperability. Sorry, so you missed that one too. We'll have all the materials up and available to you, but the session on interoperability talks about.
That's next.
So it's in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to go and not hear about inspection. No, you were in it, so sorry. It just ended. And it's the third layer of interoperability that we talk about, which is the semantic interoperability, the interpretation of the credential. And we'll talk about that. Nico.
Yeah, the question around completeness of data, I think is similar to what was just being asked. So let's say I'm a student and I have a badge from the University of, I don't know, Columbia here in New York, and my employer verifies that. But they also want to see my transcript for some reason, but Columbia has opted to not show that on my as part of my profile, so it's not accessible through my wallet. So what does that mean for the individual and for the employer and the university? So does the employer now still need to go to Columbia to verify the...
If the employer needs information that isn't part of the verifiable credential, they'll use the old method. Yeah, that's why we want this to be broadly adopted. So you don't have this and that. It just makes life more complicated instead of better. I only have a couple minutes, so 3 more quick questions. So one, there's tons of content here. Again, everything will be available. Is identity. So we raised the question of identity. Okay, and there are lots of options in identity, but each of you knows your business and how you identified someone today. So we were already picking on UKG. I am a Google employee. I call Google today and I say, hey Google, I need a letter proving that I worked for you. It's from this date to that date. That's, or I'm sending them an email saying, could you please get me a PDF file of proof of my employment, or some process that exists today. Somehow they're identifying them, that person. Are they identifying them based on their Google ID number, their employee ID number when they were an employee, based on their address? What are they asking them? Whatever that is, however you're identifying your individuals today, that's the question you should be asking. What are our identifiers? What data do we have in our systems? When someone asks for data on them that we hold, as an issuer, what are we doing today, right? Currently, we enable identification through any combination, or some combination, not yet any combination, sometime any combination, of email, and it could be multiple emails because you have a personal email and work email and so on, phone, it could be multiple phones, ID document, which can be a passport, a driver's license, a national ID card in those countries that have that, and so on. All the identities that you can do a verifiable credential of on the wallet. So think about what you use today and what combination you want to create. When we do batch issuing, and again, Moshe Tzvi will show that tomorrow, we can only use one parameter, and it can only be either an email or a phone number. So if you're issuing something more complicated than that, or you need identity that's more sophisticated, that batch issuing is not the solution for you. But for use cases like Yoko presented from Etan today, where they're showing a certification internally to 300 people inside the organization as a learning process, it's a great way of doing it because it's an internal Etan email. I could trust anyone who has access to that email and is verified it as an employee, and it's a certification that we can trust. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you get the idea. Let me, because I want to get through these three last slides, and we're almost out of time. And then if we have some more time, and we can always talk about it in one of the breaks. The third issue that you have to think about is timing. So I'll give you an example of an issue we have right now. We're doing a pilot with the 3 Dutch banks, Rabobank, ING, and ABN. We're doing a session tomorrow morning around the banks. You're invited to come here. Paul, you're going to be with me in that. Paul's going to be there in that session. And the use case is really, really interesting. The 3 banks want to share mandatory bankers' learning credentials, because if I leave Rabobank and I move to ING today, I need to take 3 or 4 or 5 days of mandatory learning, which are required by the Central Banking Authority or whatever in the Netherlands. And I've done it. I could have done it 6 months ago, but there's no compliant way of proving that I did it and safe way of doing it. And so the banks can't accept you telling or reporting that you did. And so the banks are going to be each issuing to individuals a credential of exactly the curriculum that they've learned and the courses they've completed. And then the person can share that. And by sharing that, the bank is compliant. The person doesn't need to waste 2 or 3 days learning. They're not paying money for those courses, so the ROI is immediate. They've found a really simple use case, immediate value. People moving between the banks is a big part of their population move. Okay, so that's the use case. And then the question we came up with, wait a minute, do we issue the individual when they do the course, or do we issue the individual when they leave the bank? There are different options. Right? We all agree, by the way, just as an interesting story, that in the long run, what we want to do is you issue when you complete. You complete a course, you get an email or a notification saying, you just completed this, wonderful, would you like to have a verifiable credential on your wallet? But for the pilot, we want to show people that have already left and already joined the next bank and already verified, because that's where the value is created. If we wait till the people that are joining now do that, we'll have to wait a year or 2 years or 3 years and people actually do that. So for the pilot, we're going to be issuing when people leave. So when they leave, we'll tell them, here's the verifiable credentials of your mandatory learning. If you want to be able to use it in another bank, because it'll save you a lot of headache, here, take it. Okay, but that's just an example. Some employers, we've had conversations with employers who have said, I'm not going to issue verifiable credentials while they're employed with me. I'm just helping them leave. Personally, as an HR professional for 25 years, I would argue with that statement, and I would think it's absolutely the opposite. But even if you have customers who that's what they believe, that's okay. So when it's part of the process of leaving a company, offer verifiable credentials. It's a policy decision. It's not a network issue. It's nothing to do with the velocity network when you actually issue. The one before last I mentioned earlier, we know it's going to be really, really critical how this is communicated to individuals. Right? We know that this is new. Some people talked about it at the sessions this morning, at the different panels. And change is new, and people that are not tech savvy and never heard of blockchain, this is, what do I do with this? Why would I want it? I need to download an app. A lot of questions. So how this is communicated, the first issuing event, the second issuing event, the first time I hit this is really, really critical. And since many of you are going to be issuers for the first time, so many of your constituents will meet this for the first time in their life, right? How this is communicated is going to be very, very important for the level of adoption and acceptance, right? And again, what we're planning on doing any of you who are willing to share your experiences, your statistics, the letters you used, the communication you did, videos you made for your employees, any of that is what we'd like to build a bank that we can all learn from. We have a joint interest together to do this well, because if this is not adopted, we're all investing and it's not adopted. So we want to learn from each other. And so that's what we're going to do here. One of the things is to link, for instance, to the website. The new website was built, among other things, now because people are starting to accept credentials, and we wanted them to be able to go somewhere and read about it. Instead of each one of you writing what verifiable credentials are, you can send any of your individuals to the Velocity Network Foundation website, which now has a section for individuals with language for them and explanation for them. And the last item here, I'm going to plug for the last time. Go to Moshe Tzvi's session tomorrow. Batch issuing we came up with because we really want you to experiment and try. And building a full-fledged integration, as the SciSift team will say, is work and takes time. And we want you to get there, because in the sustainable long vision, that's where this is going to work. But in the short term, if you want to start playing around with this, you need solutions that are simpler and easier, and batch issuing is a simple and easy way of getting going. So we want to encourage you to do that. There's some information on what you need. Everything will be shown tomorrow very, very nicely. There's some limitations. This is not a full-fledged, we've built it quickly and limited, but I don't know what that was, but that's batch issuing. Now, we're out of time, but since inspection is a little easier, let me just stop here and ask if there's any questions about everything we've talked about. Yes?
I have a question on the time of issuing. So let's say I leave a company and I never registered or created my email as an identity in my wallet.
Right.
Is there a way that I can pull those records from the previous employer? I mean, email is the only one that I could think of, because the phone number is not a mandatory field in many cases. So how do we do that? Today, to identify email, we need to get the PIN, right, to just get it to your.
Right, you won't have, if you've already left and you didn't download one, didn't verify your Google, we'll take Google as an employer all the time, a Google email, then you won't be able to prove that you had the Google access to the Google email. My question would be, and UKG probably have a better answer than Cornerstone, only because of their business, is what does someone do today if they wanted a proof of their learning or their employment 2 years afterwards? There must be, we're not trying to solve all the problems, right? There must be some process today of saying who I am and verifying that.
So it usually, they send an email to the HR department and they kind of go back and look at their employment history and give them a letter or something.
But how do they know that this is actually the person requesting that letter?
I don't know.
So there is a manual process, right? Everywhere there are protocols. Like for example, today experience validation is given to, I can give my colleague's phone number. I don't have to give HR's, unless I am going through some immigration services or something like that.
Or background screening.
Then, so there are different ways to go about it. But suppose, say, for example, you want formal issue credential verification. And that was my question also. I'm actually coming back to my question too. So in this case, like, okay, somehow you have to get a contact of HR's phone number or HR's email. And they have to basically drill in, because they'll come back to you, they'll call you. Who are you? When did you work? Tell me who is your manager. And all these things happen. It's not a...
That's what we're getting, and our vision is that will not exist anymore.
Yeah. So now, coming back to my question about identity, there might still be an issue. For example, even the person remembers the email.
No, it doesn't matter if they remember. If they don't have a verifiable proof that it's theirs, they don't have access to it.
So the question I have is basically, we don't store PII data permanently if the employee is deactivated. I mean, most of the data is gone, and basically we just have a
So they won't be able to have. So again, our rule, by the way, for almost every answer, and we need to get into more detail, which to explore. But our rule is we're not trying to make a perfect world. We're trying to make a world that's equal or better in every parameter than the world today. If today, after 7 years, you've erased the data and I can't get proof then it's not going to change. And if today there's some way of checking who the person is,
So if those are interested, please do look at tomorrow's challenges, which highlight.
I have no idea what that is and where it's coming from. Okay. Anyway, if there's no access to, today people aren't claiming learning from Cornerstone or from Saba or from Edcast or from SumTotal. You keep buying the whole industry. It's a problem. Today, after they leave, so today there's no solution in those systems for identity. If there becomes a market for people wanting to have their credentials, they remember a year later or 2 years later, I'm sure the Cornerstone will figure out a way to maintain some kind of identity because there'll be a demand for that. There just never had been a demand for that right now.
Yeah, especially my question was related to if there is a name change. I mean, we continuously...
Nope, no problem. We had lots of discussions. I think Jim's going to talk about it, or his team in tomorrow's session, example by Decisive. A name change doesn't change the did of the individual. It's still the same individual. There are issues that Decisive and Higher Right brought up in our standards committee around how do we know that? How do we know that if someone was issued a Harvard degree, we can turn the sound off. I mean, I'm not using it.
Research, because actually it isn't.
I was actually issued my degree at Harvard with my maiden name, and that's what's in their systems of record, and now I have a different name. How do I investigate and know that it's the same person and so on? So Decisive have raised that, and we made changes to some of our schemas as a result. And that's the last thing I'll just say about issuing before we move to...
And have further discussions.
Just turn it off, something.
I think I should be touching this now.
I don't know. Okay. Identity is a big, we have lots and lots of thoughts about identity. It's just a whole big topic, which I can't spend more time on now.
How are we solving this with universities and colleges?
The same way great question. So the same way we're solving it with everybody else. So Dole mentioned it a little bit earlier today. We know that there's no way of going employer by employer, education institution by education institution. That'll take us our lifetime. The reason many of the members here are systems that are already the systems of record for many of those institutions or the credentialing platforms for many of those institutions and so on is because when Cornerstone, SumTotal, Saba, and Edcast all adopt verifiable credentials, which you're doing, then all of your thousands of employers and hundreds of millions of people have the access to verifiable credentials. Now, that's not everyone. That still takes time. And so there comes in players like Decisive and Higher Right and Infomart and other background screeners who will be acting as notary issuers. So they're verifying a lot of types of information already and will be issuing notary issuing. So that's another piece of that. We do support self-reported information. It doesn't have the value of verification, but at least has a complete profile. That's another part of that answer. So there's more. So we know it's a process, but we want to be able to create utility value early, even before that process is completed.